Okay, I'm going to start. Thanks, Pam, so much. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're really excited to talk to you about a relatively new program called the Canadian Species Initiative. And over the next hour, we've got a few goals for this talk. Amy, next slide, please.
Oh, hold on. Oh, sorry, it's going slowly, but it's going.
Okay, so over the course of the hour, we have a few things that we want to accomplish with this presentation. So one is to really increase awareness amongst this community of the one plan approach and available IUCN conservation planning specialist group tools. We want to really emphasize the importance of an integrated conservation planning approach and the contribution of zoo-based scientific data collection and research and sharing of expertise in a one plan approach concept, which we'll talk about quite a bit. We want to introduce this Canadian Species Initiative that's being spearheaded by our two organizations, Wildlife Preservation Canada and African Lion Safari, and recruit additional partners to participate, as well as really mobilize the Canadian herpetological community to participate in Canadian Species Initiative efforts to identify appropriate ex-situ roles for target Canadian species at risk. But before we get into all of that, next slide, please.
Okay, sorry, my slide advancing.
There we go.
Okay.
I will just give more of a heads up and speak very slowly.
Okay.
But first, yeah, we wanted to take a little bit of time just to introduce ourselves and provide a bit of a backgrounder. So as Pam said, my name is Jessica Steiner and I'm the Conservation Programs Director for Wildlife Preservation Canada, or WPC. We are a national nonprofit that's dedicated to species at risk recovery. And we really focus on species that require more than habitat protection alone. We specialize in hands-on interventions such as conservation breeding, translocations, head starting, etc. We work collaboratively with partners, including a number of zoos, on a diverse suite of species recovery projects, for example, loggerhead shrike in Ontario and Taylor's checker spot butterfly in BC. And while these projects typically include a wide range of conservation activities, they're really anchored by these hands-on applied management actions.
Okay, hi, so I'm Amy Chabot. I'm trying to both do video and slides and talk at the same time here. Okay, so I'm the Research and Conservation Programs Coordinator at African Lion Safari. The safari is a Canadian-owned business. It was created in the name of conservation by the late Colonel Daly more than 50 years ago. The opening of the park was the fulfillment of his dream to create a drive-through wildlife sanctuary dedicated to the conservation of declining wildlife species. Our manner of exhibiting animals is completely different from the traditional approach. The visitor is caged in their vehicle while the animals are free to roam in large open reserves. The safari has developed a reputation for its excellent care and management and conservation of many endangered species, and often we've innovated methods for species that are typically found challenging to breed in human care, such as Asian elephants, Rothschild's giraffe, and blue-throated macaw. We're also involved in several conservation initiatives for species endemic to North America. For example, being a partner in the conservation breeding and release program for the loggerhead shrike, and helping to develop husbandry and breeding protocols for native pollinators as well. Okay. All right, so everyone here is familiar with the stats and the loss of biodiversity that's being experienced worldwide today. As habitats and ecosystems become increasingly altered and impacted by human activities, a growing number of species are becoming threatened and will require conservation actions to ensure their survival. The numbers closer to home are much the same. The National General Status Working Group of the Canadian Endangered Species Conservation Council reports on the general status of species in Canada in their wild species reports that are produced every 5 years. The working group is comprised of representatives from each of the Canadian provinces and territories and the 3 federal agencies whose mandate includes wildlife. The most recent, or 2015 report, assessed approximately 27,500 Canadian species, and they identified that about 6%, or more than 1,600 species, as being potentially at risk in Canada. Approximately half of these species have already been assessed in detail by the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada as being either extirpated in Canada, endangered, threatened, or of special concern. Another 59 were considered data deficient, and an additional 19 species were assessed as extinct. So it's obvious that our human footprint is large and that there are very few species left that are free of human impact, if any. Given new and emerging challenges such as diseases and climate change, there is an increasing need for species conservation to include active management. So instead of a strictly yes or no to human intervention, we instead are seeing more of a continuum in recovery efforts, with most species requiring some degree of hands-on action. Here we see the continuum of recovery actions from captive management, which is species exclusively managed in captivity, to self-sustaining wild populations which require no intervention. So you may be familiar with the terms in situ and ex situ. As a refresher, ex situ refers to actions that occur outside of a species' natural habitat, for example, within a zoo or aquarium or botanical garden or even biobank. While in situ conservation efforts, on the other hand, are those that occur on site with wildlife populations within their natural habitats. So this graph essentially represents a continuum of efforts from exclusively ex situ to exclusively in situ. So while it's apparent that there's a need for ex situ management, many people have questioned whether zoos are meeting this increased need. And from all angles, unfortunately, the simple and definitive answer is no. This graph shows the proportion of species that fall into the 3 International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN's, Redlist threatened categories of vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered that are currently held in zoos. So for example, in the bottom bar of the 224 amphibian species listed as threatened on a global level, only 25% can be found in zoos. The situation is much worse with birds, where only 8% of threatened species currently exist somewhere in a zoo collection. Perhaps of interest to this group, we see here the representation in zoos summarized at the taxonomic order level within reptiles and amphibian classes. While reptiles seem to be faring better, so for example, 68% of threatened turtles, tortoises, and terrapins appear in zoo collections, the proportion of threatened species held in zoo holdings is still generally low. So essentially, zoo collections are not prioritizing at-risk species. In rebuttal, it has been suggested that zoos might house instead a number of species that are not of conservation concern on a global scale, which is what the IUCN Red List represents, but which are listed more locally as threatened species. In an attempt to quantify this, our colleague, Dr. Kevin Kerr at Toronto Zoo, did a rough preliminary assessment of the holdings of Canadian species within Canadian zoos using data from ZIMS, which is a zoo record-keeping system. When he looked at the proportion of Canadian species held at the threatened at the federal or provincial level in Canadian zoos, he found that especially for mammals and birds, collection space is still mostly being filled with species that were not at risk. Additionally, the vast majority of the threatened species holdings don't represent viable populations in the long term, even among cooperative breeding programs. So there is most definitely a gap. At least part of the reason that integrated species conservation plans have not been developed is that traditionally, species conservation planning has followed 2 parallel but separate tracks. Wildlife managers and biologists and zoo and aquarium managers work independently from each other to help develop conservation plans for their respective populations. Zoos are focused on developing plans for their collections and their captive populations, while field-based groups such as NGOs and wildlife managers are focused on recovery activities with wild populations. There is often a lack of acknowledgement and sometimes even outright dismissal of ex-situ management by in-situ communities in Canada, which can lead to a lack of at least consideration of all possible roles that zoos and aquariums can have during species conservation planning. Conversely, zoo and aquarium communities are not always fully aware of the in-situ recovery efforts and priorities. So in essence, they're operating in silos. An integrated approach to conservation planning is required to allow consideration of all the available and effective conservation methods possible, including, where appropriate, ex-situ methods. The Conservation Planning Specialist Group, or CPSG, is a specialist group of the International Union for Conservation of Nature's Species Survival Commission. It was formed in 1979 to meet a need for liaison between academics, field conservation community, and the captive breeding community. CPSG's mission is to save threatened species by increasing the effectiveness of conservation efforts worldwide. They do so by using a multi-stakeholder workshop processes and a variety of science-based tools to ensure that more effective species conservation plans are developed and implemented. And in addition, they offer training opportunities to help build capacity for species conservation planning worldwide. CPSG supports the joint development of management strategies and conservation actions by all responsible parties, which is called the One Plan approach. Key to the success of this process is ensuring full participation by all stakeholders from the planning stages. So this ensures that the full complement of knowledge, skills, and strengths are brought together to identify the most effective conservation actions. The One Plan approach acknowledges that when used strategically, ex-situ conservation can be a key tool for species conservation that complements field conservation efforts. Recognition of the value of this approach is growing, and there is a motion even that will be voted on at the upcoming IUCN World Conservation Congress to make the One Plan approach status quo. So in that way, it would become embedded in policy at the national government level. The One Plan approach is already being adopted as a new paradigm for species conservation throughout the world, with examples ranging across taxa from insects to birds and beyond. There are examples from threatened reptile and amphibian species in North America and worldwide, such as the Western pond turtle and the Bellinger River snapping turtle, in which ex-situ and in-situ activities are being integrated to improve conservation efforts. So recognizing the critical need for significantly ramping up CPSG's integrated conservation planning and the One Plan approach in Canada, Wildlife Preservation Canada and African Lion Safari joined to launch the Canadian Species Initiative, or CSI. Through the use of science-based, inclusive, and participatory planning processes, we're striving to ensure that all possible management options are considered and most effective methods of addressing Canadian species conservation needs are implemented. The main goals of CSI are to increase the awareness of potential ex-situ conservation roles among species conservation planners and population managers, to provide tools and processes for evaluating and incorporating ex-situ options into species conservation planning and zoo collection planning, and to involve both in-situ and ex-situ communities in One Plan approach, species conservation planning and collection planning. CSI, or Canadian Species Initiative, also serves as CPSG's regional resource center in Canada, bringing these recognized and proven species conservation planning tools and approaches to projects here, and advocating for their use at all levels. The foundation of CSI is CPSG's inclusive workshop processes. During these workshops, both in-situ and ex-situ communities are brought together to develop recommendations for integrated species conservation plans, in which ex-situ activities are identified based on a species conservation needs and practical constraints, which inform zoo collection plans in order to more effectively serve the conservation of wild populations. A critical first step, though, is deciding whether or not an ex-situ program is appropriate. And if it appears that it would be, then to determine what specific conservation roles it can play for a particular species. So ex-situ programs have been used to provide conservation benefit for many species at risk. A few examples are provided here. We see the scimitar horned oryx, which was once considered extinct in the wild and has now been successfully reintroduced into its original range countries from captive populations. Another example is black-footed ferret. All remaining 18 wild individuals were taken into captivity, and through conservation, breeding, and reintroduction efforts, the species numbers in the thousands in the wild now. Conservation, breeding, and release efforts for both the Hawaiian nene and the loggerhead shrike here in Ontario are helping to stabilize and augment the wild populations. However, not all species will benefit from ex-situ management. The IUCN's Species Survival Commission has produced guidelines that assist in identifying when and how ex-situ management can contribute to species recovery. Their guidelines present a 5-step approach, which provides a structured, informed, and transparent decision-making process on whether or not ex-situ activities are beneficial and appropriate component of a species conservation strategy. So this approach ensures that any ex-situ activities that are recommended are tailored to the conservation needs of species. The 5-step process is intended to be flexible to fit the needs of different taxonomic groups. It includes briefly first reviewing the threats and the current status of both the in-situ and the ex-situ populations, then moving on to identify potential ex-situ conservation roles, determining the program characteristics and scope necessary to meet these roles, and then assessing whether resources are needed and the risks and feasibilities of doing ex-situ management, and finally making recommendations regarding the appropriate role and structure, if any, of the ex-situ population activities. The potential role that an ex-situ program might serve must be identified very clearly. The guidelines identify a number of potential roles for ex-situ programs that can help both directly or indirectly to address the threats or challenges that a species is facing. For example, turtle head starting is an example of demographic manipulation. So where eggs or hatchlings are especially vulnerable, efforts like artificial incubation of nests and head starting hatchlings to a certain size within the safety of an ex-situ facility may actually increase the survival of these life history stages. Targeted education and awareness programs can directly address threats. For example, human persecution is an identified threat to Massasauga rattlesnakes. The Toronto Zoo runs periodic workshops within the species range to help foster appreciation and positive attitudes toward this misunderstood species. Participants get to learn about the snake's biology and life history, how to be good stewards, and they also get a rare opportunity to safely get up close and touch a real Massasauga rattlesnake. One ex-situ program can serve several conservation roles, either simultaneously or consecutively. So for example, the snakes used in Toronto Zoo's education program are also part of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums Eastern Massasauga Rattlesnake Species Survival Plan, or SSP, which represents the managed breeding population for the species, with animals are spread across a number of different institutions. The SSC population contributes to the support of in-situ conservation projects, public education, professional training, scientific research, and it also acts as an insurance population that may serve to augment or reestablish wild populations in the future. The Eastern Loggerhead Shrike program is another example of how one ex-situ population can play many roles. A captive population of shrike is held in several Canadian and US conservation breeding centers, including African lion safari. This population was created as an insurance against extirpation of the species in Eastern Canada in the late 90s. We're using the population held in our care for research, for example, how it's allowed us to better understand how the impact of West Nile virus is impacting the species. And we're currently investigating the impact of climate versus genetics on migratory urge in the species. So not only has the population helped us buy time while we identify and address the causes of threats, over 1,000 young have been produced from annual reproduction at the conservation breeding facilities and released into the wild, where they augment the wild population's productivity. And results from a PVA indicate that these birds have actually kept the species from becoming extinct in Ontario.
Okay, over to me. So this diagram shows how the IUCN's 5-step decision process, the yellow numbers that you see, is incorporated into species conservation planning process to develop an integrated conservation strategy for a species using the one plan approach. And this process really ensures that potential ex-situ actions are given the due consideration and that their appropriateness is evaluated to ensure that they have a net positive impact on the conservation of a species. Next slide. And in an ideal world, every threatened species would already have an integrated conservation plan developed using the one plan approach that zoos could then use to guide them in their collection planning and conservation activities. But the reality is that only a few species have these plans. And meanwhile, zoos and other organizations need to make more immediate decisions regarding their collections and activities. So to help address this issue, the Conservation Planning Specialist Group developed the Integrated Collection Assessment and Planning Workshop, or ICAP. And ICAP brings in-situ and ex-situ communities together to apply a logical and transparent decision-making process to the task of collection planning for species conservation benefit. These ICAP workshops take us through the IUCN's 5-step process for a group of species, with the result being that we can identify which species would benefit most from ex-situ actions, provide program specifics to meet the identified roles, and prioritize actions. The World Association of Zoos and Aquariums is heavily promoting the one plan approach and this process, and the European Association of Zoos and Aquariums is now adopting ICAP workshops as their status quo for their regional collection plans. And the Canadian Species Initiative is actively working to facilitate collaboration between members of Canada's accredited zoos and aquariums, CAZA, and the in-situ community. So CAZA is the accreditation, it's an accreditation and advocacy organization that represents all of the major zoos and aquariums within Canada. And they've created a subcommittee to specifically work with us on this initiative. And ultimately, the initiative will provide guidance to its members on how they can best address recovery priorities for Canada's native species. And we've begun discussions with other important groups, for example, government, to bring them into the discussion. This is really meant to be a coalition of the willing, and we're hoping to bring on many additional partners as we move forward to ensure that the ex-situ management needs of Canadian species at risk are identified and implemented. And we really hope there are folks amongst this crowd who are interested in joining us. So as part of Wildlife Preservation Canada's Conservation Action Plan, we have combed published recovery strategy documents and identified species for which some form of ex-situ management has been identified as a recommended approach in these recovery documents, or additionally as able by species experts. And here, this is a snapshot of that list. So highlighted in blue, I recognize it might be a little bit hard to see, but highlighted in blue are species that WPC has been involved with in some way through either our own projects or providing financial support. And in red are additional species for which ex-situ recovery activities are being implemented currently by CAZA members or other institutions to our knowledge. And these are only the species for which ex-situ options have even been considered. So the list is quite long, as you can see, and currently you can see that a good majority of the species are still in black, meaning that they have no active ex-situ efforts, even when it's a recommended recovery approach. If we focus in, we can see that the most extensive list is among the herpetofauna, and this demonstrates that the need is great and that ex-situ management actions are already part of the discussion in many cases with this taxonomic group, or these taxonomic groups. But it's really obvious that even with a very good idea of the species for which ex-situ actions are most urgently needed, integrated collection assessment and planning really remains a gap in our efforts in Canada to conserve our native biodiversity. One of CSI's first projects is to run an ICAP workshop, and this was meant to be scheduled for this winter. But the year hasn't been what I don't think any of us have expected, and it's had to be pushed forward due to the pandemic. So we've been working to engage relevant stakeholders with the goal of having our inaugural ICAP workshop in early 2021, which will be focused on Canada's snake species. And thank you to the CHS website for providing all these excellent snake photos. After internal review and discussions with a number of snake experts across the country, it was felt that there was great opportunity to advance snake conservation in Canada through this process. Next slide. So this pie graph considers COSEWIC recognized snake designatable units, of which there are 39, and more than 60% are at some level of risk, and 2 species are entirely extirpated. There are 8 snake species on WPC's Conservation Action Plan list. Here you can see the Ex-situ tools that are recommended either in recovery documents or by species experts. In most cases, we are still at the stages of needing a feasibility assessment done for potential reintroductions. Only Massasaugas currently have active Ex-situ efforts underway in Canada that are integrated with wild population recovery goals. And this is the Massasauga SSP that was discussed earlier. So as Amy went over, the goal of an ICAP workshop is to bring in-situ and ex-situ communities together to apply the decision-making process of the IUCN SSC guidelines on the use of ex-situ management for species conservation to the task of regional or global collection planning. So in this case, the focus would be on collection planning for all of our Canadian snakes, so all 39 DUs, designatable units, at Canadian facilities. The ICAP process provides a comprehensive assessment that will enhance snake conservation in Canada by providing guidance to zoos on conservation priorities for collection planning, conservation education messaging, in-situ field support, and integration of in-situ and ex-situ efforts, as well as by promoting collaboration between CASA members, so the Canada's accredited zoo and aquariums, field-based conservationists, as well as relevant IUCN Species Survival Commission specialist groups. And the ICAP process also provides that feasibility assessment step, or at least a good proportion of it, that is so needed for many of our species at-risk snakes. Additional CSI projects are also underway with loggerhead shrike and woodland caribou, utilizing other planning tools such as population and habitat viability analysis workshops, or PHVA. So a typical PHVA workshop features the scientific rigor of a population viability analysis, so a PVA, using modeling to help wildlife biologists and managers more clearly understand the threats that influence populations. What a PHVA workshop does is combine the efforts of a PVA with a facilitated workshop framework to really help people organize and evaluate information across a broad range of disciplines and perspectives. So it allows us to take into account the social, cultural, and economic needs of the local people in order to create more effective actions for species conservation. So again, the emphasis is really on these holistic, integrated, multi-stakeholder planning and implementation processes. And when the local stakeholders are involved in helping to create the action plan themselves, they're much more likely to implement it. And through the use of these science-based, inclusive, participatory planning processes, do we see a theme here? CSI is really striving to ensure that all the possible management options are considered and that the most effective methods of addressing Canadian species conservation needs are implemented. The Canadian Species Initiative will ensure that the ex-situ management needs of Canadian species at risk are identified and met by applying the one plan approach process to Canadian species recovery. So this integrated approach ensures that the full range of stakeholders are involved in the planning process, including field biologists, wildlife managers, First Nations, academics, and the zoo and aquarium community. So as we've mentioned before, this initiative was really founded and spearheaded by the two of us, Amy and Jessica. The steering committee also currently includes Dr. Kevin Kerr from the Toronto Zoo, and we've got additional capacity provided by Stephanie Winton, who's WPC's Species Conservation Planning Assistant, and Hannah McCurdy-Adams, who's our Reptile and Amphibian Program Development Coordinator. So these are names that I'm sure many in this group are familiar with. We'll be expanding our network in the near future as our collaboration with CASA and its members develop. And the strength of CSI really depends upon the active participation and collaboration of all relevant stakeholders. So we are specifically going to need broad participation of species experts, relevant government agencies and personnel, and Indigenous communities in the snake ICAP workshop. We're also looking for volunteers who may be interested in serving on the planning group for this workshop. So while we're putting together an invitation list, we would encourage you to reach out to us directly to let us know you're interested in these upcoming opportunities to participate and get added to our contact list. And please share these opportunities through your networks. And I see that Hannah's diligently putting our contact information into the comment section, so you're able to get it there as well. Also, please feel free to contact us to discuss one plan approach planning needs for other species or taxonomic groups. And that's actually all the presentation we had. So it's a bit shorter than we anticipated, but we hope that there is opportunity for discussion and questions. Yeah, so thank you very much.
I don't know how to do the clap thing. You can do the little, yeah. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. We have a wonderful sized group tonight. I think we've got 25 of us on board. So if folks want to ask questions or can open it up for discussion, if you would like to unmute yourself and just chat away, that would be lovely. Or if you're more comfortable putting it in the chat, then I can read your question out. So I'll open it up to the floor, and please feel free to ask any questions or oh, folks have to raise their hand. If I'm being dopey, apologies. If I'm not seeing you, shake your hand. Okay, I'm gonna ask a question. It's a little sidebar, but it was something that popped into my head as I was working through this. Are there opportunities to do research in zoos? It kind of popped into me where that would just continue to sort of increase engagement between those two silos as you laid out. Is that a possibility? Sorry, I don't do research in zoos, so I
think Amy and I are looking at each other to see who's going to answer, but Amy, you could go ahead.
Yes, definitely, and that's something that I'm trying to foster. And there's a tremendous interest within CASA members more generally. It seems that the way it's happened to date more so is that individual CASA facilities might have a relationship with a local university. African Lion Safari had a relationship with Queen's University through myself. I ended up doing a postdoc here, and then the position that I'm in now was actually created to keep me on. So, and this was actually brought up at last year's annual CASA meeting, and essentially the people in the room just they didn't know how to bridge that gap. They don't know how to reach out, and so that's part of what we're trying to do with CSI is to bring those communities together. So there definitely is opportunity there. There was an NSERC program which is now ended called Renew Zoo that was helping to try and connect the two together. I believe it's in its final year. So if this is something that folks are interested in, feel free to reach out to either Jessica or I, and then hopefully there will be opportunities in the future. And there are some really, I'm actually have done a couple of grants through NSERC's Alliance program, which is an industry academic partnership, and with industry in this case being the zoo and aquarium community. So there's even funding for it out there.
Do you guys qualify for MyTax funding? Or?
Yes. Yep. I have a MyTax PhD student right now working on trach care.
Sweet. My current grad student is MyTax funded with Nature Conservancy Canada, but Oh, amazing. Jackie is popping up some comments. Oh, Tom, yep, please go ahead. Do you want to just chat, Tom?
Sure,
Yes.
if possible. Can you hear me?
Mhm.
Yeah, no, first of all, I'd like to thank you for the presentation. Very helpful. This is a bit of a testimonial, but also a kind of a plea. And we've had a lot of success in recovery work with Blanding's turtle in Nova Scotia by working together with a zoo here in Nova Scotia, but also significantly with the Toronto Zoo over the years, with a lot of captive rearing and incubation work. And it's worked really well. I think it's worked because of the scale on which the project evolved. I think there's historically been a divide between these two communities that is so strong that the default position is to separate yourself. And what we found was when we were actually working on common problems with a single species, it worked really well. And those barriers broke down very quickly. And it certainly changed the way that I looked at the work that can be done between in situ and ex situ. But I'm wondering whether there's not a way to increase that conversation at a higher scale than the species specific one to try to expedite this interaction. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think there is. That's what we're working on. So things got a little stalled out over the last year in terms of our discussions with Canada's accredited zoos and aquariums. What we're hoping to work together with this subcommittee to create opportunities for more dialogue. So for example, just at their annual conference even, there was a great opportunity there to connect some additional meetings to that, where there could be discussions around, for example, opportunities for research with zoo collections and that sort of thing. So yeah, I don't know, Amy, do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, this was, so I'm, in addition to my position here, I'm an adjunct at Queen's University. And so I have been wanting to, through CSI, sort of amongst the academic community, figure out who is that coalition of the willing. I tend to know of some people through my own experience, and then you hear of others. And so I haven't yet actually figured out a good way for all of us to network together. I mean, that now with virtual meetings, I think getting everybody around the table and discussing, what and how we might help and whatnot is much more doable than we might have thought it was a year ago. But it's that sort of logistic. How do we figure out who we are and figure out who to talk to each other? I think once we have that within the academic community, reaching out to CASA is probably going to be much easier to actually do. And it is facilitated, I think, a lot too, with single species. And that's sort of part of what we're trying to do with CSI. So, but it would be great if we could build a community that wants to, interact and liaise between the two. I think that would be great. I'd love to talk to you more about it, or anybody else as well.
And our hope is that we can really showcase the power of this through some of these workshops. So especially with the inaugural, like the snake ICAP and our Shrike PHVA, we're really trying to also include participants who are there more as observers at various levels of government and decision makers, but also those who we feel would benefit from observing the process and seeing the power of it and what can be accomplished in that way. And so really using these workshops, to benefit the target species, but also to really showcase the process itself.
Is that ICAP meeting going to be virtual if it's in the winter, or is that the hope? I mean, I'll be honest, it's kind of a blessing and a curse in the sense that we have gone virtual because I've been able to participate in more things. But do you have a sense?
We were just talking about this today. So we were sort of holding out on making a decision, but as things progress and the state we're in now, it feels sort of inevitable that it's going to have to be virtual. So normally it would take place over several consecutive days as an in-person workshop. As a virtual workshop, it will be split into smaller sections over a longer period of time. So this will be facilitated by, you know, an expert from CPSG. The goal, though, is that for myself and Amy and others to actually receive training to be able to facilitate these workshops ourselves down the road so that we have the capacity within Canada to implement these workshops. But this one would be run by someone within CPSG, facilitated by them. And I don't know, it may be one of the first ICAPs that's done virtually, I can't remember, but we've already been discussing what that might look like and how it'll be broken up. And stay tuned, we'll hopefully broadcast that information through CHS channels as it comes about.
This ICAP is a relatively new workshop process within the CPSG's workshop processes. So they haven't had a lot of them yet, and they haven't actually had a virtual one yet. They just last week had their annual meeting virtually, and I think they really pushed, in terms of virtual meetings that I've seen, they really pushed the limits of it and are getting quite proficient in, you know, breakout groups and that sort of thing. So I know I'm feeling much more comfortable about being able to do it virtually, and also in some ways I think it's great. Less flying is a good thing.
Yeah, I think there's probably greater ability to get the people that we need across the country participating for the Snake ICAP if we go virtual. So it is, as you say, a blessing and a curse.
Jackie's popped up a comment in the chat. Can you guys see it?
Do you see, Jessica, do you want to, Jessica and I actually had a fair exchange back and forth after we were both on the same webinar today as well. And then directly after that, we went into the CPSG's annual weekly staff meeting. And there's, again, they have some processes. There's a new one that's being developed called A to P, which is assess to plan. One of the things that was mentioned on the webinar today was just the vast number of Canadian endemic species for which there hasn't been that detailed COSEWIC assessment, and there's a bit of a bottleneck there. So anyway, Jessica probably has some more that she wants to say on
Oh, I'm trying to digest what Jackie put up. So she's talking about a webinar today that was hosted by the Canadian Key Biodiversity Areas, KBA, which is taking an area rather than species-specific approach to conservation, combining the approaches. Yeah, I mean, as Amy said, we both were sitting in there and we're always looking for collaborative potential. And WPC is actually already part of the KBA coalition, so we are tied into that group and looking for opportunities. There's also a recent part of that webinar actually was Dan Krause talking about the R's to save and endemic species, which is what Amy was talking about. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunity there, and to have the background data and those mapping capabilities already available will really, you know, it provides quite a lot of resources to make these workshops successful, because sometimes the stumbling block is just making, like, where is the data? How do we get it together? And that can really lengthen the process because you're having to assemble it. So to have that work done and available and accessible, as far as the KBAs and the Canadian endemic species, is really extremely valuable and will be an excellent resource for this moving forward.
Can I just jump in, Pam? I'm just curious about the first ISAP workshop, including all 39 species of snake, and what is this decision-making process about that versus you know, lowering it to a smaller subset and maybe covering a wider range of stakeholders potentially being able to attend, or if there's like a maximum size to these workshops, or like how is that decision made?
Maximum size for species?
For like participants at the workshop, right? Because you're trying to capture as broad from my understanding, you're trying to capture a very broad group of field biologists as well as zoos and potentially other people who might have experience with these species. So I imagine having 39, like every snake in Canada would make that group quite large, and there's a possibility that you might miss people who are working on a species.
So I'm going to have faith in the CPSG process. So their very first ICAP was for 43 canid species globally. And so that included quite a large group. That was done in person. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there's much experience in having these. I don't know what we're still trying to wrap our heads around what the invitee list is going to look like, and that's something that we're working on right now. But that was definitely taken into consideration. So we're not going to, like, the people that need to be there that have the expertise are going to be there.
There's also when we were considering it and we thought about doing a smaller group, then there's actually a lot of overlap amongst the people that need to the expertise. So it's a bit of a trade-off all the way along in terms of how many species or the size of the group of species that you're trying to put through the ICAP process. The more you have, the less time you're going to spend on each one. But at the same time, if you limit it to too small a group, then it gets to be more of an ex-situ feasibility process. So we actually agonized and took quite a while to end up on snakes, but we thought that it kind of hit as close as we could come to the sweet spot of, a good number of species, a lot of overlapping expertise amongst species and the people there in terms of the size of the group. But one of the things about the CPSG's workshop processes is just there's a tremendous amount of work that goes in ahead of time, and I think that really assists in what might be an otherwise much more unmanageable task. So the stakeholder analyses and figuring out all of that is part of it. So, and one thing, Kathy, I'm talking to Kathy Traylor-Holzer from CPSG. Oftentimes what happens is that some species, like a number of those species, just get quickly just kicked off the list as, know that there isn't a role for ex-situ management or something like that. And then you narrow it down to a smaller list, and then you kind of take those and you dig into it over the course of the remaining workshop.
Yeah, it was highly, because we had a lot of discussion in terms of, do we go for the entire taxonomic group? Do we go even broader? Do we go down to just those that we know? There's been a recommendation of some sort of ex-situ management approach, and it was highly recommended that we stick to one type of species, so snakes, and that we keep it broad to start and not do any sort of decision making ahead of time, because if we choose a subset, then we're already making some decisions and some determinations, but really that should be done by the group as a whole.
Anybody else want to jump in? Feel free to just jump in. We've got a small group, and I apologize if I'm missing anybody.
I have a question, Pamela.
Yeah, go ahead, Joe, please.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a really exciting initiative, and I think it has a lot of value from a species sort of conservation planning and management perspective. I know that when we're trying to, when we're working on provincial recovery strategies and the government response statements, it can there often isn't a lot of information to draw from in terms of whether or not or how much focus to put on actions dealing with the ex-situ conservation of species. And I know with Massasauga, for example, it was a huge amount of effort to get that in the GRS, and thanks to Johnny and all the work that he did and all the information he provided. Mm-hmm. And so I think this will provide a lot of value from that perspective. I'm wondering what the specific outcome will be of the workshops, whether it will be a conservation plan that will make very specific recommendations with respect to whether or not those actions are necessary and what actions are necessary that sort of government agencies could just sort of go in and pick up and add directly to recovery strategies, and what sort of efforts might be made to engage and involve government agencies in the process.
So Joe, you're on the list that I just haven't gotten to yet, so I want to talk to. So yes, we've done some engagement at the federal level, and there needs to be some more at provincial level. That needs to begin. But I think you've nailed it. So essentially, by having this group of experts together and having this report come out with very specific recommendations about what ex-situ roles can be achieved and how they can positively impact wild population recovery. The hope is that, like, the strength of that group decision making can then be taken and used within recovery documents. But we realize that, you know, the time span for these recovery documents and revisions is quite lengthy. And as well, we're dealing with recovery documents, especially at the federal level, that are quite dated. So the goal is that eventually it will get into those at the next revisions, but it also gives something more immediate that the zoo community can use when they're having their collection planning and deciding, you know, what species and what number to have in their holdings, as well as new projects and programs that they can initiate within their institutions. And the hope is across multiple institutions of CASA potentially rallying behind, you know, a certain group of species or a certain subset of species. So, you know, there could be, you know, a big snake day across Canada with institutions participating in various ways that have been identified through these means. Just sort of like you see Migratory Bird Day, but of course that's not necessarily a direct role, but there's things that can be done like that, and then really targeted and more direct programs within individual institutions. So yeah, I mean, the ultimate goal is that, yes, it will get right into recovery documents, but in the meantime, it's actually providing some concrete actions to the zoo community and the connections to actually get them going. Yeah. And integrated with in-situ efforts.
And integrated with academia and research as well, because that very first step of the process is that threat assessment, and often the knowledge gaps come into there. So for example, with tailor checker spot butterfly, we're trying to do a bit of that to figure out what a research project would look like for a particular student, but it's really going to end up being embedded within a larger research project that sort of comes about because we sit down and we do look at the threats and see what needs to be done. And then those research opportunities become apparent, and the role of the zoos become apparent, and the connections can start being made, hopefully. So, yeah.
Anybody else want to jump in? We're sort of rounding up on 8 o'clock. And I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. I think Jessica and Amy would be willing to stick around if you wanted to chat with them more one-on-one, or of course you've got their contact information in the chat. And if you misplace the chat because it's going to close when the meeting closes, you can always reach out to me through conference@canadianherpetology.ca. I can connect you. Yeah, is there anybody else that wants to sort of jump in or ask any more questions? Otherwise, I think not seeing, I think I'll, if you could just join me in thanking them. It was a great talk. I'll be honest, it's not an area I know as much about, I'm ashamed to say. So I'm in one of those silos. So thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us tonight, letting us know. And the hope is that we'll stay connected with them so that if folks want to participate in the workshop or other activities, that would be wonderful. And I do, again, just want to remind you, so a month from today, we're going to host our second Herpetology Hangouts. So sort of same time, same place, jumping on Zoom.